Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. We appreciate your interest in our research. And also thank you to the Department of Energy for their support of this research. My name is Natalie Mims-Frick, and I'm with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And I'm going to be presenting on some recent virtual power plant or VPP reports that we published along with my co-author, Angela Long. I'm going to get us started by welcoming everyone and going over some quick housekeeping. I'll give an overview on the project. I'll share some of the insights from one of our reports on scaling virtual power plants. And then I'll hand it over to Angela to speak about utility case studies, VPP profiles, and our inventory. And then we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. As you all probably noticed, you are muted. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box that should be in your toolbar in Zoom. As you may have heard, the webinar is being recorded and the report will be available. The reports are currently available on Berkeley Lab's site, and the recording and the slides will be posted there in a couple of days. And once they are posted, I will send an email to everyone who registered for the webinar and let you know that they're up there. So getting into our content of our reports, as I mentioned, we're going to be discussing 3 new products. It's 2 reports and then a spreadsheet inventory. They were created to support public utility commissions, utilities, aggregators, and stakeholders identify how to accelerate VPP adoption and enable achieving state goals, such as resilience, peak demand reductions, and DER integration. The first report, Insights into Scaling VPPs, used research and interviews to identify opportunities to accelerate scaling VPPs. While we were developing that report, we heard a lot from interviewees that the language surrounding VPPs can be confusing, and so we developed the VPP profiles. They're conceptual models that can be used to help standardize terminology and facilitate clearer discussions. Finally, also while conducting research for the Insights report, we found it challenging to locate information on VPP programs and characteristics. And so we developed the publicly available inventory to share the information we gathered with others interested in characteristics of VPPs. And you'll hear about all 3 of those products today. For the first report, Insights to Scaling VPPs, the approach that we used was we interviewed 24 different experts for insights about scaling VPPs, and we asked them about key challenges and opportunities. Our interviews were organized around the 5 themes that are shown on the left side of the slide, which are VPP design and deployment, grid planning and operations, policy and regulatory environment, VPP business models, and designing successful future deployments. And we generated a lot of content, and we tried to summarize it in this report. We took the findings from the interviews and we organized them into 3 high-level themes, which I'll show on the next slide. And then we also created 7 different case studies on VPP implementation, and that's what Angela is going to start talking about later on in the presentation. These are the 3 themes that I just said. So we took all of the interviews and our research and looked at all of the findings and identified these 3 different themes to organize the results around. And they are the role of leadership in VPP success, grid and technology investments, and program planning and design. And the bullets underneath them are some of the actions that we've identified that utilities and regulators can take to expand VPPs. And they're organized around successful designs and deployment and operation. And I'll talk about each one of these themes and then the action items in the rest of my slides. So the first theme that we found was the role of leadership in successful VPP designs. And these are the 4 different actions that we identified that could help accelerate VPPs around this theme. So identify a clear vision and goal, establish strong leadership supporting VPPs, create dedicated VPP staff, and clearly define and use VPP terminology. So this first action, identify a clear vision and goal. I guess stepping back to orient you about what this slide shows. So the action is what the slide title is, And on the left side is an explanation of what the action is. And then on the right side, there's a graphic that has examples from our interviews. So identifying a clear vision and goal can help secure internal approval for a VPP and address uncertainties around program design. And regulators can use formal or informal processes to collaboratively develop VPP goals. A solution provider that we interviewed identified that a clear vision for VPPs requires clearly defined data requirements across all stakeholders. The second action is to establish strong leadership supporting VPPs. To sum this up, this is really that having an internal champion, either at the PUC or at the utility, that has authority to make decisions or access to a decision maker can improve the development of a VPP, and it can help navigate challenges, provide accountability, and foster collaboration. The next action is creating dedicated VPP staff, and that goes hand in hand with strong leadership. As we all are probably aware, PUCs and utilities can be very siloed, and having dedicated staff to plan and implement the VPP, including cross-functional teams at the utilities, was a characteristic of successful VPPs. At the PUC, having staff dedicated to evaluating how utilities are planning for DERs, including how VPPs can create a robust process that considers all of the aspects of grid planning, because VPPs and DERs touch many different processes, and having someone that can look across all of those different silos can help align data and scenario analysis. The next action is clearly defining and using VPP terminology. As I said, we created VPP profiles as one of the outcomes of this report, and this action really was the starting point of developing those profiles. The word VPP means a lot of things to people. So in your application, in your state or your utility, having a clear understanding of what it means when you say VPP is going to be very helpful to create clarity and streamline communications. The graphic on this slide shows some of the themes from the VPP definitions we reviewed in our literature review, as well as in our interviews while we were working on the report. So typically, or many VPP definitions have a goal and objectives. They include a diverse set of aggregated DERs. They discuss grid services and flexibility, and they also discuss control systems and software integration. We have several examples in the report of how the utilities that we interviewed defined VPP, which range from an adjective that describes a collection of resources and grid services to a platform that allows for forecasting, control, and dispatch of aggregated DERs, so very broad range. The second theme that we identified in our insights report was around grid and technology investments. Interviewees discussed the importance of making investments in software solutions and creating clear participation and communication protocols. There's many actions we identified based on our interviews that are shown on this slide. Several of them have overlapping components to them, so I'm not going to speak to all of them, but I'm going to go over each one. So the first action we identified is to align software investment in VPPs with grid needs. VPP software solutions can have a range of complexity and sophistication, and a variety of tools such as distributed energy resource management systems, or DERMS, can be used to combine aggregated DERs into a unified resource that can provide grid benefits to the distribution and transmission system and utility bill savings. Not every VPP needs a significant investment in the grid. Utilities can propose appropriate investments to achieve their VPP goals, both in the near term and the long term. And as the VPP becomes more sophisticated, we found in our interviews that it's likely they're going to need more robust software solutions, such as DERMS, advanced distribution management systems, et cetera, to efficiently control, monitor, and integrate DERs into grid operations. The next action was establishing what DERs can participate in VPP. Interviewees discussed the desire to have industry-wide guidelines to enable DER compatibility with grid requirements, and that is something that will require larger collaboration. And in the interim, utilities can establish DER participation requirements to provide clear expectations to um, aggregators or other entities that want to participate in the program about what the technology parameters are so that they can fit in and provide grid services. We heard from regulators that they're interested in what they can do to support communication and control norms to simplify the VPP process. We have some examples on the right side of the slide from Eversource and PacifiCorp and National Grid. In particular, in PacifiCorp, they have guidelines for their energy storage, including data reporting, cycling, charging and discharging, and UL safety standards. And that allows the OEMs, the original energy equipment manufacturers, to design products that align with the grid requirements in the VPP. The next action is to adopt technology standards. Um, Technology standards such as smart inverters, which aid in the integration and control of distributed solar, are within the control of the Public Utility Commission or the utility. So for example, in Oregon, all interconnecting systems must use smart inverters that are in compliance with IEEE 1547. So while not all technology standards can be adopted within the state purview, this is one example of one that can. Utilities can promote this, commissions can require it, and it can simplify the VPP process and also accelerate deployment. The next action is to enable enterprise-wide VPP adoption with integrated solutions. Enterprise-wide solutions such as DER enrollment and dispatch that allow utilities to automate VPP activities may be needed, especially as VPPs become more sophisticated. And as utilities are considering their grid investment strategy, VPPs can be an additional use case when seeking approval for their enterprise-wide solutions that may be enabling other types of DER integration onto the grid beyond what your VPP is doing. For example, Puget Sound had a VPP platform need, but they also saw the need for other tools that would help them integrate DERs into utility operations that go beyond grid operations, such as customer eligibility, um, and DER eligibility and dispatch, customer program design, and evaluation and reporting. The last two actions are around considering the need for visibility, monitoring, and control, and developing communication protocols. These are both very important aspects of accelerating adoption of VPPs, and in particular around developing communication protocols. Interviewees identified a need for investments in interoperable platforms and advanced communication protocols, as well as industry standards, and how devices can connect and interact with the grid. And I will note that as we were finalizing this report, the Mercury Consortium was announced, and they are taking a step in this direction. They're a collaborative nonprofit that's led by EPRI, and they are trying to develop and promote guidelines for consumer devices to integrate into the energy system. And it's for demand response, but that's also, part of VPP as well. The third theme that I'll talk about is program planning and design. And I'll speak to a few of the actions that we identified here. They're shown on the slide. The first example of the first action is supporting industry-wide collaboration to improve VPP design. For example, utilities discuss the importance of collaboration between solution providers and OEMs to improve program participation and cost effectiveness. And solution providers identified that collaboration can help overcome cross-disciplinary challenges, such as data integration issues, both within and across utilities. The next action we identified was to establish performance metrics. Performance metrics can be used to guide utilities and solution providers. Regulators can establish approved metrics related to DER integration or VPPs. Metrics can help align the VPP design with state energy goals, demonstrate the value of VPPs, and optimize grid performance. In utilities right now in Michigan and North Carolina, for example, have a performance incentive that's linked to their demand response performance. And so that's like a step in the direction of providing a performance metric associated with VPPs as well. The next action is on developing a VPP procurement process. And we heard from both regulators and utilities that a clear process to procure VPPs that's scalable can accelerate adoption. And in particular, regulators were interested in VPP resources, in procuring resources and ensuring that they're dispatchable and integrated into grid operations and measurables. And there's a variety of options that regulators can do to help promote this, such as defining grid services and clarifying ownership and establishing performance mechanisms. The next action is enabling robust VPP valuation. Many utilities currently rely on traditional cost-benefit tests for their VPP cost-benefit analysis, and our interviewees highlighted challenges with using a traditional cost-benefit test. There's actions that states can take or and utilities can promote robust VPP valuation. For example, you can incorporate the locational value of DERs as one way of making sure you're capturing all of the benefits of a VPP. And also explore compensating customers based on the value of the grid service that's being provided. And those are some of the opportunities that our interviewees highlighted. The next action is on utilities or aggregators designing customer-centric programs to align VPP goals with customer needs. And this is not too surprising if you make your program easy to access for your customers and also align the program's goals with what the customers view as being important. You're likely to have increased participation and longer duration participation. And we heard that flexible engagement strategies for diverse customer groups can help sustain program momentum. We also published another report on this topic in December of this year, and it's called 30 Proven Strategies to Increase VPP Enrollment. And I'll put the link to that report in the chat when I finish speaking. The last action that we identified is to use pilots to learn quickly. Utilities can use pilot programs to refine their VPP strategies, test DER integration, and address challenges early on. It's important to have pilots with clear action plans that can help integrate DERs into full-scale operations, and taking the insights from the pilots to help guide decisions on whether to continue the program or to discontinue it or to modify it. It's important to have pilots with a clear structure so you don't create a pilot that is here and then gone and negatively impacts your customer experience and hinder participation. And if you make really significant changes between your pilot and your program, ensuring that you have clear communication so that your customers don't feel like they're re-enrolling in a completely different program were some of the lessons that we heard from our interviewees. I'm going to pause there. Angela is going to speak about case studies next, but first I wanted to see if she had anything that she wanted to share or add to about the insights that we learned from this report.
Thank you, Natalie. No, I think I'll cover most of that in the next couple of slides. So I think you did a good job. Yeah.
Awesome. And don't forget to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Angela Long. I lead Rockcrest Consulting. We are out of Portland, Oregon, a clean energy consulting firm that's subbing a subcontractor to Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. First, I want to thank other contributors who helped us with this report, Ted Light with Lighthouse Consulting and Ryan Long with Rockcrest. So part of the insights into scaling virtual power plants study, a key component of that is the utility case study. So while we interviewed over 20 subject matter experts, we really wanted to look at how different utilities are deploying their virtual power plants. Next slide. So we conducted 7 utility-specific case studies. We chose our utilities based on geographic diversity as well as differing types of utilities. So we wanted to look at IOUs in markets, IOUs that were not in markets, and different smaller utilities, so cooperatives and munis. We found that of the 7 utilities that we interviewed, that all of them, while they had their own unique focuses and strategies and goals, there were some common themes around the software platforms or need for a VPP platform, the utilization of DERs as a grid resource, having a very high focus on the customer, and ensuring that whether you're in a market, leveraging that VPP for market participation, or leveraging that VPP to manage the grid, were all key components of those utility case studies. I'm going to highlight 3 case studies today. They're all fantastic, and you should read the report. The 3 that I want to highlight today are going to showcase just differing approaches. But before I get into that, I just want to mention a couple of the utilities that we're not going to dive deep into, and just say, one of the key components that we learned from National Grid was just if you're participating in a market, the high degree of telemetry that's needed in order for that virtual power plant to be able to show that that resource is online and is able to deliver the capacity that's needed. The other utility that I want to highlight is SMUD. And the key thing that I took away from our interview with them is this various terminology and inconsistent use around DER definition, or sorry, VPP definitions. We, in hearing that, took that feedback and tried to develop the framework for how a VPP might be developed. And that's what Natalie just showed in a previous slide. But it also led us to think about how virtual power plants could be categorized. And so I'll talk a little bit about the profiles that came out of that work that was inspired by SMUD. And the last thing that I just want to highlight is Pacific Core really focuses on VPPs operating as a grid resource and a fast acting resource. So if you're interested in thinking around how your virtual power plant might be able to provide grid services like frequency response, that case study is a really interesting one to look at. And then finally, if you're interested in thinking about how workforce development might be impacted as you implement a VPP, Portland General Electric is a good example of that. Next slide. So I chose to highlight Holy Cross Energy here today because their focus on their virtual power plant is really diverse in the types of DERs that they look at. They have EVs, battery storage, microgrids. They have a strong customer focus for their virtual power plant. And they really are focused on listening to their customer and delivering the benefits that their customers might need or want. And so resiliency is kind of top of mind for their customers. And that's one of the things that they've rolled into their virtual power plant. One of the key findings from their case study is just how challenging it is when you have a smaller program or you're a smaller utility in integrating OEMs into your programs. It's very time intensive. It's complex from an API perspective, but also all the off the shelf software platforms that allow you to aggregate and manage your DERs. They are really tailored for larger utilities and larger programs. And those costs the upfront cost to be able to purchase an off the shelf software solution is really high, and you're just not able to spread that across as many customers. And so that really impacts your cost effectiveness when you're scaling out a virtual power plant. Next slide. Puget Sound Energy was, I thought, a really interesting case study because they did not have a lot of demand response programs when they started their virtual power plant. They actually had a regulatory requirement that requires them to decarbonize. And so they started with thinking through what did they really want aggregated DERs to do for them. And they developed a VPP platform that would allow them to fully utilize distributed energy resources as a grid resource. And so their virtual power plant platform really is um, has been designed to function at all levels of the grid, even the distribution system, and to be scalable. And they had really strong leadership support as well as support, I think, from regulators and stakeholders to develop their virtual power plant. And that led to them creating a dedicated staff that focuses on how do you take a DER resource, bring it into your grid operations, and manage that resource as a customer experience, the customer lifecycle management, while also being a virtual button to call DERs um, as a grid resource. Next slide. The last case study that I've chosen to highlight for you today is EverSource. Their Connected Solutions program in New England focuses on summer peak and participation in ISO New England. They really focused their case study on data management, real-time operations, and program effectiveness. And so if you go through their case study, you'll hear a lot of the things that they've learned around how do you integrate DERs into grid operations and then be able to measure that. But one thing that I thought was really interesting from their perspective is as you roll out a virtual power plant, how do you think about branding that? How do you communicate what a virtual power plant is to all of the participants across that VPP? So whether it's your regulators, your your aggregators, or your customers, how do you ensure consistent terminology and industry language that allows everybody to know how to participate in your VPP, whether it's standard terminology around your resource requirements for how they need to be dispatched. So being dispatched 5 minutes ahead, 10 minutes ahead, or being able to clearly define what your VPP is. Next slide. Sorry, one more. Our insights into scaling VPP, that report really, we learned so much that it created a second report, our VPP profiles and inventory report. We had lots of learnings from the interviews, as well as all the definitions that we looked at and the research that we conducted that led us to start to document all of the VPPs that we had done research on or heard about. And we created a publicly available database categorizing all of those findings. I'll talk a little bit about the inventory later, but I do want to point out that the inventory was developed based on news articles like utility dive, press releases, regulatory filings that we researched, word of mouth. So if there are things in there as you're digging in that need to be updated or changed, please reach out to us so we can update the inventory. But we really found that there was this huge gap in understanding virtual power plants and what type of factors lead to successful VPPs. So we wanted to create something that others could leverage based on all the research we had conducted. I mentioned this earlier that in a conversation that we had with SMUD, they really were focused on what is a VPP? Like, what does that actually mean in the context of how you operate DERs? And so we created 3 profiles based on what we heard from them as well as others. And these profiles that we created are really intended to facilitate conversations and help people understand the differing strategies and goals around how you might deploy a VPP. They're not intended to be mutually exclusive or a linear process. It's really intended to help provide, I think, what your use case is, what your objectives might be as you start to aggregate DERs and deploy those as a grid resource. So I just want to note that before we jump in. Next slide. So our aggregated VPP profile is our most simple and basic VPP. It's a great entry point if you're trying to create a virtual power plant. It takes minimal setup and minimal workforce changes. This type of VPP, I think the key difference would from a traditional demand response program to an aggregated VPP is that you have the grid operator who's helping you determine what those grid services and needs might need to be for your DERs. And so you're starting to dispatch your DERs not necessarily based on um, a forecasted system peak, but you're getting closer alignment to your grid operator to use that resource to be more responsive to real-time needs. But it is still a very manual process, and meaning that your operator might call your customer program team. Your customer program team is going to call your aggregator and tell your aggregator, we need this resource at this time on this day. Aggregator is going to set up the event. Then they're going to call back the program team with what, who participated and how much, how much was there. And then you're going to report that back to the grid operator. So it's not real time. But it is still focused on providing grid services for energy and capacity and to be able to shape and shift a load. Next slide. One thing I didn't mention with aggregated is it does tend to be that an aggregated VPP has a more simple structure for DER. So you might just have one type of program like a smart thermostat. When you move to an integrated VPP, you have more diverse types of DERs that you're bringing into your program. And you're starting to have an increase in the amount of DERs that you have in your program. So the focus for an integrated VPP is how do you get greater visibility and control of those resources? And how do you start to manage them near real time as a grid resource? So this actually requires that you have some workforce changes. You start moving from a customer program team who's really focused on customer satisfaction to moving to a program team who has a strong emphasis on distributed energy resource planning and strategy and how those resources can be leveraged within the bulk system to provide grid services. So you're getting that closer alignment with your DER teams to your grid operator and your solution providers. And you do tend to have software that makes your calling events more real time. So you might have an edge DERMS through a provider that allows you to be able to control your devices at the utility level. So you're not just picking up the phone and doing manual manual calls. Um, you're shaping and shifting and shedding load for this type of integrated VPP. And let's go to the next slide. So the last profile that we created is what we call an orchestrated VPP. This type of VPP is really focused on managing aggregated DERs at all levels of the grid. So from the bulk system down to the grid edge, you're starting to think about your distributed energy resources at the local level and can they perform events to be able to help the distribution system. And you're providing more grid benefits, things like resiliency, all the way at the grid edge. This is the most sophisticated and complicated type of virtual power plant. It does require that you start to think about software changes within your utility. So you likely have an ADMS or a centralized DERMS that allow you to have real-time control and visibility of those DERs, and your grid operator can call those events when they need them. So you're shaping, shifting, shedding, and shimmying load. And it also requires that you have dedicated staff for a VPP operator that's working with the distribution operators as well as the grid operator. Next slide. So now that we've developed our profiles and we've looked at the different types of virtual power plants that are out there, we developed our inventory where we looked at where VPP is located, who is implementing them, how do those VPPs map up to the profiles that we created, and what types of DERs do they have within them. And then what other type of data points can we pull from the research that we had, whether that is energy and capacity goals, what types of incentives, how those VPPs are dispatched, who they're utilizing within their program, whether it's customer or residential, whether it's commercial or residential customers. So we collected all of those high level data points and we put them into the inventory. And one thing we noticed is that we started cataloging different virtual power plants is that many VPPs have a strong customer focus. And so we wanted to take a look at how does having a strong customer focus influence your design and VPPs. Next slide. So our inventory has two data sets. It has all of the virtual power plants that we researched, which was about 180 different VPPs, consisting of 19 gigawatts of current potential. So programs that are deploying today and in operation, and some very ambitious goals for some different VPPs. So some virtual power plants have goals to be able to achieve certain goals by say 2030 or 2035. We wanted to document all of that so we could just look at what the current landscape and magnitude of VPPs are today. And you can see here that there are virtual power plants across the US, but they're heavily focused in California today. Next slide. One thing that we learned is that utilities are a real driver for virtual power plants. They are kind of leading the pace at how you can aggregate DERs and use them as a grid resource. But there is quite a bit of support at the state, local, and federal level for rolling out virtual power plants. And also quite a few aggregators who are focused on developing virtual power plants to participate in markets. So this finding I thought was really interesting to see how, as you aggregate DERs, where are you finding that they're implementing and who's implementing them? Most of the local and national and statewide efforts were really focused on resiliency to help with extreme weather events or really focused on providing energy independence, while utilities were more focused on ensuring like safety, reliability, and resiliency at the grid level. Next slide. When we went through our VPPs and started to map them to the different profiles, we found that a large portion of the VPPs mapped to the integrated profile, making up about 10 gigawatts of the potential that was there, but a large number of virtual power plants are in the aggregated bucket as well. And so I think one of the things that I should just note is that this is a starting point for us to be able to start to understand how do people design their VPPs to meet different goals. But I do think that utilities can have more than one profile. They can have one program that's aggregated and one program that's integrated. When you move to the orchestrated bucket, you're really, because you have so much software control and visibility into your resources, you're likely to probably just have an orchestrated across all of your different platforms versus, an aggregated and an integrated. Next slide. Virtual power plants that we looked at tend to make up a combination of demand generation and storage DERs. And those VPPs are really influenced by the goals of what you're trying to achieve. So if you're trying to achieve resiliency, you're likely to have storage and demand response, maybe some generation. If your goals are focused on system peak and day ahead events, you are more likely to be just a demand only VPP. But you can see most of them do have that combination of different DERs, while a large percentage still have the demand only component. Next slide. The next thing that we wanted to do when we started looking at different virtual power plants is to compare that to traditional demand response programs as well as existing solar and energy storage programs, resources that are on the grid today. So we pulled in EIA data to be able to look at where's there potential to scale VPPs using these existing resources. Wherever we found EIA data entry that matched an entry that we had in our research, we removed that to prevent any duplicates. What we ended up with was about 800 different entries within our database that is about 27 gigawatts potential that is on the system, on the grid today. Next slide. So those existing resources, we wanted to look at the top 10 states for each of them. For traditional demand response, we highlighted in our report the top 10 states that have the ability to quickly scale virtual power plants utilizing demand response. And you can see here, states like Florida and Alabama and Minnesota have that potential to quickly scale demand response to a VPP. And that makes about 14 gigawatts of potential that we could add um, to VPPs in order to scale them. Next slide. So this is my last slide. The last thing we wanted to look at is the top 10 states that have solar and energy storage today that could be leveraged as a grid resource. So think utilizing battery storage for load flexibility. We have the states highlighted here. Potential is not as big as traditional demand response, but there's still about 460 megawatts today that could be leveraged to be able to provide that load flexibility. And then I think, Natalie, our next slide is questions. So we'll turn it over to the audience.
Thanks. I'm going to quit sharing for a moment. And we have a variety of questions in the Q&A right now. I thought, Angela, it might be nice if you could answer this question. Are there particular characteristics, profiles, or program design elements that support a virtuous cycle of VPP benefits and DER adoption? I'm thinking of states where the Commission and utilities are skeptical of the potential of VPPs as a solution for managing load growth in terms of ability to scale quickly if you don't already have high DER penetration, and how to get out of this chicken and egg space. And I thought the work that you did on the inventory and identifying DR potential might be a nice starting point, thinking about how to move forward if you don't think that if there's skepticism about the resource being there.
Yeah, well, first I'll just touch on Puget Sound Energy because when they had a policy requirement to decarbonize their resources and they decided to implement a virtual power plant, they didn't have capacity need. They didn't have really any of the main drivers that you would expect for aggregating DERs and rolling out programs like demand response. But once they got into developing the program, they found that the virtual power plant could provide solutions like non-wires solutions on the distribution side and could also help them meet like fast frequency response needs and things like that. So I think it takes so long to roll out these programs that you may not have a need today and you might, but you might have a need tomorrow. And so they're I would just caution people from thinking that a VPP doesn't have benefits in the long term. And looking at how a virtual power plant can meet needs like electrification and load growth, I think that non-wire solutions opportunity to being able to evaluate whether aggregating DERs can help you offset some of those needs is really going to be important. And so looking at VPP profiles that are focused on those locational benefits, like an orchestrated VPP, is a critical component of having that software and the visibility of the near term control.
I had a question that came in about, I think of VPPs being mainly oriented toward bulk grid services. For example, system peak management, contingency reserve, frequency regulation for PacifiCorp, for example. But do you have example of DERs, whether called VPPs or not, used to provide targeted distribution level services, such as relieving local congestion or voltage support?
Besides Rocky Mountain Power.
Yeah,
A
I don't
little
know. I can't
caveat
think.
there.
I don't have any other examples besides Pacific Core, Rocky Mountain Power either. But I think what you just said about non-wires alternatives would be the other area where you're looking at provided targeted distributional support. I don't.
Like SMUD and Puget Sound Energy and Portland General Electric are all trying to utilize their aggregated DERs at the distribution system. But it is challenging. Rocky Mountain Power is by far the best because they are leveraging their VPP for distribution voltage control and things like that.
Okay, we have a question. How have existing VPP programs simultaneously but separately valued DR events associated with system peaks and local distribution peaks? Those may fall on different hours and have different avoided costs. We didn't focus on valuation of VPPs in this report. I put a link in the chat around state regulatory opportunities for advancing aggregations of DERs that starts to talk about 2222 and valuing different grid services on the distribution system and the bulk power system. But I don't know, Angela, if you have anything else to add to that.
No, I mean, this question came up time and time again from regulators, utilities, solution providers, the valuation component of virtual power plants, that I think it is an area that definitely needs further research. We tried to just focus on a few things within this report, and um, but I do think that it is an area that needs more attention.
Yeah, it's certainly an area ripe for additional research.
Mhm.
Let's see. We have a question on, are there examples of VPPs focused on managing constraints on low voltage networks, or is the primary benefit related to balancing supply and demand at high voltage or network-wide level?
Mhm. I I would say, again, Rocky Mountain Power is probably a good example of this, but I think in the next year, as Puget Sound Energy and Portland General Electric and SMUD and others start to leverage their resources to help with some of those things, that they would be good people to reach out to and talk to if you're interested in that topic.
I have a couple of questions about the inventory. So I'm going to let you look at those in the Q&A box, Angela, and I'm going to pull up the slides again so that we can look at it.
One thing, a couple of the questions that we have while you're doing that, Natalie, that have focused on the different types of grid benefits and grid services, at the bulk level down to the distribution system and what type of attributes we had looked at. I One of the things that I think is really important is that we really were focused on how do you even get grid operators to utilize these resources, and how do you minimize barriers into entry. And most of what we heard today, before you even get to grid services and how you value them, is how do you actually build trust with a grid operator to call those events and feel comfortable knowing that it's there. And a key component to that, with every successful VPP that we looked at, was having software that gives that visibility and control to your grid operator to look at that resource like they would any other resource. And if they can't see it next to how they're looking at other resources, whether it's a peaker plant or microgrid, they're not going to feel comfortable. So that has to be the first place that you start to even getting your aggregated DERs to be operating as a grid resource. It's just building that trust. And I
So
and I
yeah,
think that's like a gap in collecting data and information if you don't have your grid operators calling events. Sorry, Natalie, go ahead.
no. So one of the questions on the inventory was, Angela, you mentioned you removed duplicates from the EIA forms. What data set was this for again? The inventory sheet has EIA data too.
Mhm. So we use the EIA 861 form and both for demand response and for net metered resources, and we remove duplicates from both of those if we had an entry in our research data set.
That was removing duplicates between the two data sets.
Uh, well, this is confusing. So the EIA actually has two data sets inside of it. We probably should have shown the crosswalk, but in the report, we have a crosswalk with the different data sets and the different types of data points that we collected. So within the EIA DER data set, which has two data sets, we made sure those entries did not have any duplications with the research database.
Right. We had a question about in your research of example deployments, did you segment initiatives between proactive versus reactive grid investments? Are there any trends or best practices for utilities considering proactive grid investments that support VPPs? Um, I don't know. You can go first if you'd like, Angela, or I can go first.
I think the biggest proactive investment that I saw was around the software to be able to have the visibility and controls, what we call VPP platform. But there is, I think the big difference between traditional demand response and a VPP is the proactive investments you have to be able to control those DERs. So whether that is hardware, things like AMI, or communication devices to be able to have control, it is pretty expensive, and there is a crossover into grid modernization efforts, and I think distribution system planning as well when you think about a virtual power plant.
Yeah, that's what I was going to talk about was distribution system planning and grid mod investments. We have a whole wealth of resources on integrated distribution system planning. I think ensuring that the utilities are being clear and articulating and prioritizing their grid modernization investments and whatever filing they're being requested is pretty important. I think there's also going to be some forthcoming research on proactive investments and uh, the the costs and or the benefits and the risks associated with that that Berkeley Lab will be coming out with. But I think just in terms of best practices, it's really clearly articulating what your grid need is, providing an analysis of what the technology investment you want to make is, as well as alternatives to the technology that you want to make, prioritizing investments with a clear methodology of why you want to make one investment first, and also articulating the length of those investments. So
Mm.
I'll try and put a link in the chat around some of those resources there. Um,
Um, Natalie, one thing that I think is important to think about is, in our insights into scaling VPPs, one of the things that we found is that successful VPPs have a lot of leadership collaboration with regulators, policymakers, and within the utility and customers and stakeholders. I think when you're setting up your VPP, you have to just know the thing I learned is you have to know what your goals are, where there's risk and where there's opportunity, and have everybody buying into that with clear metrics of knowing when you want to continue to scale your VPP or pull it back. And that pilot phase is really important to make sure that you, as you roll out your virtual power plant, whatever goals you might have, you you either clearly have metrics that show you that you have the ability to have a successful VPP, or you pull back on your pilot and you don't go forward with a virtual power plant. That alignment early on in your design is critical for success. Um, and then also like being able to learn safely too, and failing safely as you roll out your VPP.
we have a question around enrolling and retaining customers. So, from your review of different VPPs, did you find any unique strategies that were particularly successful in enrolling and retaining customers? What set them apart? What approaches proved most effective? I know you mentioned the importance of keeping enrollment simple, but I'd love to hear more details.
I think that the virtual power plants that had a customer focus, Natalie, tell me if you think differently about this. Those VPPs that had a customer focus, whether it's looking at resiliency or rural communities, they tended to be more diverse in the type of DERs that they offered. And those VPPs tended to provide more grid value because they provided storage generation and demand. And so I think that that allowed, as utilities started to look at the grid value, that allowed them to have higher incentives, be able to provide, whether it's like upfront equipment incentives or like higher program participation incentives. And that was a real key of like the avoided cost, being able to use those resources at the clock system.
Yeah, and I think that the examples that you gave when you started your answer around resilience and I don't recall what the second one was, but those it's really about finding out what your customer is interested in and
Mhm.
designing your program around that, as opposed to from the utility or grid operator's perspective saying, I need this grid service, so I'm going to try and extract that from my customers. So thinking like really flipping it around to like the customers are interested in resilience. How can I turn this into a VPP program? And the other thing that you mentioned that I think is worth highlighting is that, depending on how you define success, like integrating multiple different types of DERs is not very common in the VPPs. And so in those programs that were focused on what do the customers want, how can we use that as a grid service, there was also more diverse DERs that were being included. I also put a link to a report in the chat. So it's not in the Q&A, it came through in the chat. That's 30 proven strategies to accelerate VPP enrollment. Our colleagues were working on that report at the same time we were working on this one. So that one's completely focused on enrollment. So I'm happy I can try and stick that in the Q&A as well. Um, I also have put our emails up because I don't think we're going to get through all of the questions that we have here, but Angela and I are both available for any additional questions that you have. Um, Okay, so this one was going back to the slides for of states with highest potential for peak demand savings, just clarifying that this would be about aggregating the existing DR program resources in the VPP to unlock potential. That's yes. Okay. Let's see. Should DER maturity be taken into account to evolve customer participation and the sophistication of the VPP type? And that was around aggregation. This is around our VPP profiles. So Um, should that be one of the aspects, like in aggregation and orchestration for
Mhm.
the VPP profiles, so DER maturity? And before you answer, I just want to say that we wanted these profiles to elicit conversation and get feedback. So if you're reviewing them and you think this would be an interesting characteristic to include in it, or this one doesn't totally make sense to me, feel free to reach out to us because we know it's not perfect and it's a starting point for conversation. So we definitely welcome more questions like this. But Angela, I'll let you answer. And I think you might get the last word because we have less than a minute to go.
Um, I've I mean, I would say yes, it could be a component, but we've seen utilities go straight to orchestrated based on their grid needs. And earlier we got a lot of questions about the distribution side, and I would say the orchestrated VPPs that we saw all had a focus on ensuring that they could use aggregated DERs for distribution grid benefits. But most of them were in the process of developing software to be able to manage those devices at that level right now.
Awesome. Thank you, Angela, so much for presenting today and for all of your work on all of our research products. And as I mentioned, we will have the recording and the slides available at the same link that the report's available at, but I will send out an email to everybody who registered for the webinar that lets you know when we've posted it. And you should have our emails, so feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. And thank you again for your interest in our research. Everyone have a great day.